In front of more than 50 guests, my son-in-law jabbed a finger in my direction and said the words loud enough for the whole backyard to hear. End quote. You and Oppos. Just a tired old woman living off a pension. What makes you think anyone here still respects you? End quote. I set my glass down on the porch railing, looked him straight in the eye, and answered in the same voice I and Oppos. D once used to steady 18-year-old recruits on their worst day of basic training. End quote. I always thought a man raised right would know better than to speak to his elders that way. Especially the one who taught his son to tie his shoes. End quote. The yard went quiet enough that I could hear the ice settling in someone in Oppos' cup 3 tables away. Derek and Oppos' face went from pink to red in about 2 seconds. He crossed the grass toward me with his jaw tight and his hand curling into a fist. End quote. Say that again and I will make you regret it. End quote. He had no idea. That was the last mistake he would make in my backyard. My name is Eleanor Voss. I spent 24 years in the United States Army, most of them as a military police officer, the last 8 as a command sergeant major training new MPs how to read a room before it became a problem. I retired in 2009 at 52, moved back to the house my husband Walter and I had bought in Asheville, North Carolina in 1987, and told myself the hard part of my life was over. I was wrong about that, but it took me a long time to understand how wrong. Walter was a high school shop teacher for 31 years. He built the deck on the back of our house himself, plank by plank over 2 summers, while I was stationed at Fort Bragg and driving home every weekend I could manage. He built our daughter Renee a treehouse when she was 7 with a rope ladder and a trapdoor she was absolutely certain no adult could ever find, though of course I found it every single time she tried to hide up there after a bad day at school. Renee was, for the first 22 years of her life, the easiest person to love I had ever known. Quick to laugh, quicker to apologize when she was wrong, the kind of kid who cried at the end of nature documentaries because the mother elephant had to leave her calf behind during a drought. I used to worry that the world was going to be too rough with a heart that soft. I worried about the wrong thing. I should have worried about who she and Oppos' let get close to that heart. She met Derek Holbrook her senior year of college, at a networking mixer for a marketing internship neither of them ended up taking. He was tall, well-spoken, the kind of handsome that photographs better than it holds up across a dinner table over time. He had a way of filling a room with his voice before anyone had asked him to speak. Walter noticed it before I did. End quote. He talks like he and Oppos' already decided how the conversation ends. End quote. Walter said after the first dinner we had with the 2 of them, Derek explaining at length why the restaurant and Oppos' wine list was mediocre to a waiter who had not asked his opinion. End quote. He and Oppos' young. End quote. I said. End quote. Confidence is not the same thing as arrogance. End quote. Walter looked at me over his glasses in the particular way he had, the one that meant he loved me too much to argue but wasn't. And Oppos' changing his mind. End quote. Sometimes it grows up to be the same thing. End quote. He said. End quote. We and Oppos' LLC which one this is. End quote. We found out at the wedding, in a small way that I dismissed at the time and have never forgotten since. Derek and Oppos' toast ran 14 minutes. He thanked his fraternity brothers, his old boss, and a business mentor he described as, end quote, practically my second father, end quote, and mentioned Renee by name exactly 3 times. Walter and I were not mentioned at all. Renee laughed it off in the car afterward, end quote, that and Oppos' just Derek, he gets nervous and rambles, end quote, and I let it go because that is what you do when your daughter is happy and you want to believe the man she chose is going to be worthy of her. I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not writing this to make myself look wise. I saw the warning signs the way most people see them, clearly in hindsight and much too late to matter in the moment. Love makes fools of smart people. It made a fool of me for the better part of 6 years. It started with a leaf blower. Derek and Renee bought a starter house 2 streets over from ours in the spring of 2018, close enough that Renee could still walk over for Sunday dinner, which felt like a blessing at the time. That fall, Derek knocked on our door on a Saturday morning, easy grin, gesturing at our garage. End quote. Hey El, mind if I borrow the leaf blower? Mine and Oppos' on backorder and my yard looks like a crime scene. End quote. I did mind a little the way you mind small things you and Oppos' V decided aren't and oppos. T worth minding out loud. I gave it to him. 2 months later I noticed it was still sitting in his garage, dead leaves from his yard still clinging to the intake vent, and when I mentioned it he laughed and said, end quote, "Oh yeah, I meant to bring that back," end quote, and did not bring it back for another 6 weeks. That was the first entry in a ledger I did not yet know I was keeping. The pattern that followed was not dramatic. It never is with people like Derek. Each request was reasonable enough on its own that objecting felt petty. Each time you gave in you told yourself it was the last time, and it never was. He borrowed my pressure washer and returned it with a cracked hose he never mentioned or replaced. He borrowed Walter and Oppo's cordless drill set, the good one, the 18-volt kit Walter had saved up for over an entire summer of teaching shop to teenagers who thought safety glasses were optional, and I found it 8 months later at a barbecue at Derek and Oppo's house, sitting on his workbench when one of his co-workers admired it. And quote, "Man, nice kit. Where and Oppo's do you pick this up?" And quote. Been building up my collection over the years, end quote. Derek said without a flicker of hesitation. End quote. You gotta know a good deal when you see one. End quote. My husband and Oppo's tools. Derek and Oppo's story. I stood there with a beer sweating in my hand and felt something tighten low in my stomach. The particular heat of being erased in real time in a conversation about your own property. I did not say anything. Renee was standing 6 feet away refilling a bowl of chips, and I did not want to start something at her house in front of her friends. The television came next. An older but perfectly functional flat screen. We and Oppo's D moved out of our bedroom when we upgraded. Derek showed up the next day with his truck already running before we and Oppo's D even mentioned giving it away out loud. Renee must have told him. End quote. You sure you Don and Oppo's T need it? End quote, he asked, already lifting it off the stand. I said go ahead because it truly was extra, and because saying no to my daughter and Oppo's husband over a television felt small and mean in a way I did not want to be. 3 weeks later I was in their house using the bathroom and glanced through the cracked bedroom door. My television was mounted above a gaming setup, controllers scattered across the nightstand, a bag of chips going stale on the dresser. It had become, in the span of 3 weeks, Derek and Oppo's television in the same way the drill kit had become his collection. Then it was the driveway. Our house has a 2-car garage that has fit exactly 2 cars since 1987. Walter and Oppo's old Buick and my Subaru side by side, the way we and Oppo's parked them for over 35 years. One Tuesday morning I came downstairs to find Derek and Oppo's black pickup filling my bay. He and Oppo's D apparently decided at some point after midnight that walking the extra 60 feet from his own driveway was more inconvenience than he was willing to bear, and helped himself. My Subaru sat outside in October frost with a windshield I had to scrape by hand at 6:45 in the morning, because I still walk 3 miles most days and I like to start early, before the heat came up. I knocked on his door. He answered in a t-shirt, coffee in hand, entirely unbothered. And quote, "Come on L. It and Oppo's just a parking spot. You and Oppo's retired, where are you even going this early?" End quote. That and Oppo's not the point, end quote, I said. He shrugged, the particular shrug of a man who has never once had to absorb a consequence he didn't and Oppo's choose for himself. End quote. I and Oppo's I'll move it later. End quote. He moved it 4 days later. Then again the following week and the week after that. I started warming my own car by hand in the cold, breath fogging, hands stiff on the scraper, because 35 years of marriage teaches you which battles your husband will fight for you without being asked and which ones he and Oppo's will quietly absorb the same way you do, out of a stubborn, misguided kindness toward everyone but yourselves. Walter never said a word about the parking spot either. That was its own kind of hurt, though it took me time to name it. I watched him from the kitchen window one January morning, 71 years old, scraping frost off his own windshield in the driveway because our son-in-law had decided our garage bay was more convenient than his own, and saw him. Effing in my chest went cold and quiet and permanent. A person who takes your parking spot will eventually try to take everything else. I did not yet understand how much everything else was going to cost. Walter had a garden, 14 years of it, tomatoes and peppers and 3 raised beds of herbs, he dried in mason jars he lined up on the kitchen windowsill by variety, each one labeled in his crooked shopteacher handwriting. Every spring he spent a full Saturday on his knees in the dirt, and I used to lean in the doorway with my coffee and watch him hum to himself, utterly content in a way I rarely saw him at any other time of year. End quote. Ellie, come look at this one, end quote. He and Oppos, D call out, holding up a tomato the size of a fist, grinning like a boy. End quote. Biggest one yet. Has to be the new compost mix. End quote. End quote. It and Oppos. S because you talk to them, end quote. I and Oppos, D tell him. End quote. You always have. End quote. He and Oppos. D wave me off laughing, but he and Oppos. D be smiling for the rest of the day. Derek started taking from that garden the same casual, entitled way he took everything else. Renee mentioned it first almost as an aside. End quote. Mom, I hope you Don and Oppos T mind Derek grabbed some tomatoes this morning. He was making a salad for his co-workers. End quote. Walter looked up from the stove, careful, measured. End quote. He could and Oppos V asked, end quote, he said. End quote. It and Oppos. S just tomatoes, Dad. End quote. Renee and Oppos. S voice had a flatness to it that had crept in over the last year. Not rude exactly, just sealed off like a window painted shut. End quote. You have so many. End quote. Walter didn't and Oppos. T push back. He never did. But I saw his jaw tighten, and after that, Derek helped himself whenever he pleased. Peppers for a party, whole bunches of rosemary. Renee said she needed for some recipe she never actually cooked. Walter never said a word directly to Derek. He and Oppos. D come inside from the garden, and I would see it in the set of his shoulders, that particular quiet that meant he was absorbing something and choosing not to let it show. Then came the electric bill. In February of our second year of this, the power bill came in at $312. Our average ran closer to $140. I checked everything, new LED bulbs throughout the house, thermostat exactly where we always kept it. Nothing had changed on our end. I walked the property line on a Saturday afternoon and found the answer within 5 minutes. An orange extension cord, run from the outdoor outlet by the garden gate, through a gap in the fence, all the way to Derek and Oppos' driveway where his truck sat charging overnight, every night, apparently for weeks. I went next door and knocked. Derek opened the door with his phone in one hand, thumb still scrolling. End quote. That outlet by the garden, that and Oppos' coming off my meter, end quote, I said. End quote. My bill doubled this month. End quote. He looked up slowly like I and Oppos' interrupted something important. End quote. Come on, L. We and Oppos' family. You and Oppos' not gonna charge family for electricity, are you? End quote. He tilted his head, smiling, easy, unbothered. End quote. That and Oppos' be a little embarrassing, Don and Oppos'. Do you think? End quote. I looked past him into the living room. Renee was on the couch with her laptop. She had heard every word. I could tell by the stillness in her shoulders. End quote. Renee, you want to weigh in on this? End quote. She didn't and Oppos' look up. End quote. Mom, it and Oppos' really not that big a deal. We and Oppos' I'll figure it out. End quote. I drove the 4 minutes home with both hands tight on the wheel, and my jaw aching from clenching it the entire way. Walter was at the sink when I came in. He took one look at my face. End quote. What happened? End quote. End quote. Nothing, end quote, I said. End quote. I handled it. End quote. He dried his hands slowly on the dish towel, watching me the way he and Oppos' watched me come home from deployments, checking for the things I wasn't and Oppos' going to say out loud. He crossed the kitchen and put both hands flat against my collarbones, the way he and Oppos' done since we were 23 years old and just married and certain the whole world was still soft enough to be kind to us. End quote. We and Oppos' going to be okay, end quote, he said. End quote. You hear me? End quote. I covered his hands with mine and held on a little longer than I needed to. End quote. I hear you, end quote, I told him. But standing there I understood something I and Oppos' been avoiding looking at directly for a year. The problem was never the extension cord or the tomatoes or the parking spot or the tools. The problem was that every single time I looked to Renee to draw a line, she looked away instead. And I was running out of ways to pretend that didn't and Oppos' break something in me that I wasn't and Oppos' sure would ever fully mend. Then Micah was born, and for a while, everything felt like it might be all right again. Renee called us at 5:12 in the morning on a Thursday in April. Walter grabbed the phone before the second ring, and when he heard her voice he pressed his free hand over his mouth and his eyes filled up so fast I thought something had gone wrong. End quote. He and Apo's s here, end quote, Renee said. End quote. He and Apo's s healthy. He and Apo's s perfect. End quote. Walter made a sound I had not heard from him in years. Somewhere between a laugh and a sob, completely unguarded. He grabbed my arm and squeezed. We were at the hospital within 35 minutes. I held Micah for the first time in a rocking chair beside Renee and Apo's bed. 7 pounds 2 ounces, wrapped tight in a striped hospital blanket. Face scrunched up like he was still deciding whether the outside world was worth the trouble. I had carried a sidearm through 2 deployments, restrained combatants twice my size, run interrogation rooms that would have made most people and Apo's hands shake. And this 7-pound person made mine shake in a way nothing else ever had. End quote. Hi there, end quote, I said quietly. End quote. I and Apo's am your grandmother. You can call me Gigi. End quote. He yawned. His whole face moved with it. Walter laughed through his tears. End quote. Already has your attitude. End quote. From that morning forward, Micah became the center of our world, and it did not take long before he became our responsibility as well. At first the arrangement seemed reasonable. Derek and Renee both worked full schedules, daycare was expensive, and we lived close by. End quote. Just a few hours on Tuesdays, end quote, Renee said early on. Then Tuesdays became Tuesdays and Thursdays. By the time Micah was 18 months old, Walter and I were the ones getting him up in the mornings, feeding him breakfast, taking him to his pediatric checkups, reading him bedtime stories on the nights Derek and Renee had somewhere better to be. I did not resent a single moment of that. Let me be clear about it. Teaching Micah the names of every tool in Walter and Apo's garage, how to water the tomatoes without drowning the roots, how to identify the birds at our feeder. Those were some of the best hours of my retirement. There was a night in his second winter that I have never fully let go of. Micah woke at 2 a.m. running a fever of 103. I called Renee and Apo's cell straight to voicemail. I called Derek and Apo's 4 rings, then voicemail. Walter and I worked through the night, cool washcloth on his forehead, children and Apo's Tylenol every 4 hours, me singing low in the rocking chair while Walter sat on the floor beside us until the fever finally broke around 5 in the morning. Derek called back at 7:50. End quote. Hey, sorry, phone was on silent. How and Apo's the little man. End quote. My hand tightened around the phone. Walter was asleep in the rocking chair with Micah curled against his chest, cheek resting on top of his head. End quote. He and Apo's okay, end quote, I said. End quote. Fever broke a couple hours ago. End quote. End quote. Oh, good. Yeah, we had a late night. End quote. He yawned into the phone. End quote. We and Apo's I'll swing by after breakfast. Renee wants to sleep in. End quote. I did not respond right away. There was something moving through me I had no clean word for. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something heavier than both. End quote. Sure, end quote, I said finally. End quote. He and Apo's I'll be here. End quote. Micah stirred, blinked awake, and looked straight at me. End quote. Gigi, end quote. He said, voice rough with sleep. End quote. You stayed. End quote. End quote. I stayed, buddy. Gigi and Apo's always here. End quote. He closed his eyes again. And I sat there on the kitchen floor at 5 in the morning, quiet, wondering when exactly the word family had stopped meaning the same thing to all of us. In the spring of 2023, I had an idea. Walter had always wanted to see Charleston. For as long as I could remember, he and Apo's kept a folded stack of magazine clippings in his nightstand drawer. The ones about the battery and the old churches, the pages soft at the corners from handling. He never pushed for it. That was Walter and Apo's way. He wanted things quietly, tucked them away neat. I understand that clearly now. But she was still my daughter, and some stubborn corner of my chest still believed that shared time might close the distance that kept growing between us. End quote. Of course, end quote, I said. End quote. The more the merrier. End quote. Derek booked himself and Renee a room on a different floor of the same hotel. The drive down was 3.5 hours. Walter and I sat in the back seat of Derek and Appo's SUV with Micah buckled between us and 3 suitcases stacked behind our heads. Derek and Renee sat up front, seats reclined Derek and Appo's AirPods in from the moment we hit the highway. Micah fell asleep on Walter and Appo's shoulder within the first hour. I watched the side of my husband and Appo's face and thought about all the road trips we and Appo's taken when Renee was small, how I used to play license plate games and sing off-key to the radio and pass back crackers in little plastic bags. Now Walter sat in the back seat of his son-in-law and Appo's truck like a passenger in his own life. At dinner the first night, Derek ordered without glancing at the prices, a $30 appetizer, a bottle of wine I didn't and Appo's catch the name of but caught the number on the check when it came. He ordered for Renee too, which she didn't and Appo's seemed to notice. When the bill arrived, Derek slid it across the table to me without a word. No discussion, no hesitation. The smooth practiced motion of a man who believed there was an arrangement nobody had bothered to tell me about. I paid it. Walter and Appo's hand found mine under the table and squeezed once. The second day, I and Appo's planned a walk through the old market and along the seawall. Walter had a photograph of that exact stretch of wall pinned to the corkboard in our kitchen. We had looked at it together more times than I could count. Micah woke up cranky, and Derek decided that meant the whole group should stay close to the pool. End quote. We Don and Appo's want to drag him around in the heat, end quote. He said, stretched out on a lounge chair, phone balanced on his stomach. Walter stood at the window of our room that afternoon, looking out at the harbor. I came and stood beside him. End quote. We could still go, end quote, I said quietly. End quote. Just the two of us. Micah could stay with, end quote. End quote. It and Appo's fine Ellie. End quote. His voice was soft but final. He put a hand flat against the glass. End quote. We and Appo's I'll see it another time. End quote. We did not see it another time. The last night, after Micah was asleep and Derek and Renee had gone to their room, Walter and I sat on our balcony with the door cracked. The water below was dark and slow, lit up gold in long streaks by the bridge lights. He had a glass of sweet tea. I had nothing. End quote. Ellie, end quote. He said finally, careful, like he was picking up something breakable. End quote. When was the last time it was just the two of us somewhere like this? Quiet. Just us. End quote. I looked at his profile in the low light, the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes I had watched deepen over 38 years and loved every one of. End quote. I can and Appo's remember Walter, end quote, I said. End quote. I honestly can and Appo's remember. End quote. He nodded slowly and looked back at the water. We didn't and Appo's say anything else. 38 years gives you a language that doesn't and Appo's need words. What we said to each other that night without speaking was that something had to change. I just didn't and Appo's know yet how far I was willing to go to change it. Part 5. What Renee never said. We and Appo's been home from Charleston 3 weeks when I finally learned the piece of the puzzle I and Appo's been missing, the one that reframed everything that came after. It was Margaret Ito, my closest friend of almost 20 years, who told me, not out of gossip but out of genuine worry, over coffee at her kitchen table. End quote. I Don and Appo's know if this is my business to say, end quote. She started turning her mug in slow circles, end quote. But Renee came by last month asking if Tom and I knew any good bankruptcy attorneys. She didn't and Appo's say it was for her. But she looked like she hadn't and Appo's slept, end quote. I sat very still. It took me another 2 weeks of careful, sideways questions to piece the rest together. Derek and Appo's firm had quietly restructured his commission plan 18 months earlier, and his numbers had never recovered. They and Appo's financed the truck, refinanced the house once already, and were 3 payments behind on a home equity line neither Walter nor I had known existed. Derek had never told Renee the full extent of it, only enough for her to feel the walls closing in without understanding why, which is its own particular kind of cruelty, leaving someone to carry the weight of a secret they were never given the whole shape of. It did not excuse what he and Appo's done. I want to be clear about that because I have heard people twist stories like this one into forgiveness they were never owed. Financial fear does not turn theft into borrowing. It does not turn a stolen parking spot into a misunderstanding. But it explains something about Renee I had been too hurt to look at clearly. The silence, the flatness, the refusal to draw a line. She was not choosing Derek over us because she didn't and oppose love us anymore. She was drowning quietly beside a man too proud to admit he and oppose pulled her under, and she had decided, somewhere along the way, that keeping the peace at home was the only thing she still had power over. It broke my heart in a new way to understand that. It also clarified, with a coldness I did not expect from myself, that understanding a reason is not the same thing as accepting a result. My daughter and oppose fear did not entitle her husband to my husband and oppose tools, my electricity, my garden, my grandson and oppose fevered nights alone. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. I had spent a year confusing them for one another, and once I stopped, I never confused them again. The following Wednesday evening, Renee came by for what she called a quick visit. She sat down at the kitchen table and poured herself a glass of water, and there was something different in the way she moved. Slower, like she was bracing for something. I set 2 cups of tea down and sat across from my daughter. Walter stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, close enough to hear, far enough to let us have it. End quote. Renee, end quote. I began, my voice low and warm, the way it always was when I was trying not to hurt someone. End quote. Your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking about things that have been going on. End quote. I wrapped both hands around my cup. End quote. We love you. We love Micah more than anything in this world. But the way things have been, the borrowing, the electricity, the garden, the driveway, watching Micah nearly every day without anyone asking, honey, we feel like we and oppose been taken for granted. And I think Derek needs to, end quote. Renee set her glass down on the table. Not loud but deliberate. End quote. Mom, end quote. Her voice had that painted shut quality I and oppose come to dread. End quote. I really wish you wouldn't and oppose do this. End quote. End quote. I and oppose am your mother. I need to be able to say these things to you. End quote. End quote. Derek is under a lot of pressure right now. End quote. Her jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the table. End quote. You don and oppose see what he deals with. He and oppose doing his best. End quote. End quote. His best. End quote. My voice cracked on the second word just slightly. End quote. Renee, your father had a garden he spent 14 years building. Derek picked it clean without asking. He used our electricity for months. He takes your father and oppose parking space in the winter, and your father doesn't and oppose say a word because he doesn't and oppose want to start something. We watch your son almost every day, and not once, not one single time, has Derek looked either of us in the eye and said thank you, end quote. Renee stood up so fast her chair scraped back hard. End quote. I can and oppose keep having this conversation. Every time I come over here, it turns into this. End quote. End quote. Sit down, Renee. End quote. My voice rose just enough to carry weight. I pushed back from the table and stepped toward her, one hand reaching out. End quote. I and oppose am not finished. Your father and I are not getting any younger, and I need you to hear, end quote. Renee turned sharply, one arm swinging out to create space between us. It was not a strike. I believe even now that her hand caught my shoulder as I stepped forward, and the momentum was simply wrong. My foot caught the leg of the table, and I went down hard against the corner of the counter. The sound of it went through Walter like a current. He was across the room in 2 steps, knees hitting the floor beside me. End quote. Ellie, are you hurt? Look at me. End quote. End quote. I and oppose am all right. End quote. My voice was shaking. End quote. Walter, I and oppose am all right. End quote. My arm was already going to bruise. I could see the red mark blooming beneath my sleeve as he helped me up, his arm around my back, and I could feel him trembling against me. Renee had not moved. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, one hand over her mouth, eyes wet and wide. For one suspended moment I saw the little girl I had raised looking back. End quote. She walked to the door, hand on the handle. End quote. Renee Marie. End quote. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Not a shout, not a plea. Something colder and more final than either. End quote. You are not the girl I raised anymore. I don and oppose T know who you and Apos, V become. End quote. Her shoulder blades pulled together like she and Apos, D been struck. She stood there 3 full seconds without moving. Then she walked out and closed the door behind her. Walter held me in the kitchen a long time. Through the gap in the curtains I could see Micah and Apos' silhouette on the couch next door alone, lit blue by a television. 9:00 and Apos' clock on a Wednesday night. I held Walter tighter and did not say a word, because there was nothing left to say. The silence hadn't and Apos' already made perfectly clear. Walter was asleep by 10. I checked the bruise on my arm once more, already coming in purple and wide below the shoulder, pulled the blanket up around him and sat in the chair beside the bed until his breathing evened out. Then I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on and never poured anything from it. I just needed something to do with my hands. I pulled down the photo album from the hall closet and sat at the table with it. The first photograph was Renee at 2, sitting in a cardboard box in the living room of our old base housing, grinning the gap-toothed grin of a child who has just discovered a box is the greatest invention in human history. I remembered the weight of that disposable camera in my hand. I turned the page. Renee at 8, standing in the doorway of the bedroom Walter had built her. 3 weekends of work, the particular shade of lavender she and Apos' picked from a fan of paint swatches with the seriousness of a person making a permanent decision. The little reading lamp above the headboard because she liked to read before sleeping and he didn't, and Apos' want her straining her eyes. I remembered bringing her in with her hands over her eyes, and the sound she made when she finally saw it, pure and unguarded. Daddy, it and Apos' perfect. It and Apos' exactly perfect. More pages. Renee at 15 in the pale blue dress I and Apos' saved 6 months to buy her, the one I and Apos' pointed out in a store window in October and set money aside for week after week until the formal in February. She hadn't and Apos' known. She and Apos' opened the garment bag and screamed and spun around the living room and hugged me so tight I laughed and told her to watch the pins. There were no photographs from that day with me in them. She and Apos' taken pictures with her friends outside the gymnasium, not one with her mother. Near the back, a photograph I had almost forgotten. Her college graduation, June of 2015. Cap and gown, arms around my neck, face flushed with pride. Beneath it, in my own handwriting, Renee and Apos' promise, June 2015. She had stood in front of our whole family that day, my sister, Walter and Apos' brother, a table full of cousins, and turned to me, said it clearly enough for every one of them to hear. I promise you when you and Dad get older I and Apos' am going to take care of you the way you took care of me. Promise. Walter had covered his mouth with both hands. My sister had started clapping. I hadn't and Apos' trusted my voice, so I and Apos' simply pulled Renee in and held her. That photograph still hung on our living room wall, right where I and Apos' put it 9 years ago. I closed the album and sat in the quiet kitchen, and felt the full weight of everything settle onto my chest. Not as anger. Not even as grief exactly. Something older and heavier than both. The specific ache of a woman who had loved without condition and learned, too late and too clearly, that love given without limit is not always love returned in kind. I put my hand flat on the cover. End quote. I gave her everything I had, end quote. I said aloud to the empty kitchen, to Walter asleep down the hall, to 38 years of the life we had built together. End quote. Everything. End quote. The kitchen clock ticked. I stood up and made a decision that had been building for months, maybe years, but that I had kept pushing back because I was a mother, and mothers are the last ones to give up. No more talking. No more waiting. It was time to start preparing. I want to tell you about 2 people before I tell you what happened at Thanksgiving, because without them, none of what came later would have gone the way it did, and I and Apos' come to believe that the version of this story that leaves them out until the very end does them both a disservice. The first was Detective Renata Cruz, retired 31 years with the Asheville PD, the last 9 of them in domestic investigations. She and Apos' lived 2 doors down from us since 2011, and we had become genuinely close the old-fashioned way, over fences, over borrowed cups of sugar that were really just excuses to talk, over the particular kinship that grows between 2 women who and Apos' spent their careers being underestimated by rooms full of men and learned to use that underestimation as a weapon of their own. Renata had watched Derek and Apos' S behavior develop over the years with the same quiet, professional attention she and Oppos D once brought to a case file. She never said much about it unprompted. That wasn't an Oppos T her way. But she noticed things, the extension cord, the truck in our driveway at odd hours, the particular way Derek and Oppos S voice changed pitch when he thought no one but family was listening. The second was Warren Achebe, senior partner at the investment firm where Derek worked, a man I and Oppos D met exactly twice before that Thanksgiving, once at Renee and Derek and Oppos S wedding briefly, and once at a company holiday party Renee had dragged us to 2 years earlier, more out of obligation than desire. Warren was quiet in the particular way that powerful men who Don and Oppos T need to prove anything are quiet. He and Oppos D shaken my hand at that holiday party and said, unprompted and quote, Renee talks about you and Walter like you hung the moon. I hope Derek knows what he and Oppos S got marrying into a family like that. And quote, I and Oppos D thought little of it at the time. I thought about it a great deal later. In January I made 3 calls. The first was to a family attorney, a woman named Priya Deshmukh with an office downtown, whose card I and Oppos D been given by my own sister years earlier and finally had reason to use. I sat across from her on a Tuesday morning and told her plainly what I needed. End quote. I want to update my will, end quote, I said. End quote. I want Renee and Derek removed as beneficiaries. All of it, the house, the accounts, the investment portfolio. I want it restructured to go into a trust for Micah directly, administered independently, protected from access by either of his parents until he and Oppos S an adult, end quote. Priya looked at me for a moment over the top of her glasses. End quote, Mrs. Voss, that and Oppos S a significant change. Can I ask, is this something you and Oppos V thought through carefully? End quote. End quote, I and Oppos V been thinking about it for 2 years, end quote, I said. End quote. And I watched my husband go down on a kitchen floor 3 weeks ago because of the people I and Oppos D be leaving things to. I and Oppos V thought about it carefully enough. End quote. She nodded once, opened a legal pad and uncapped her pen. End quote. Then let and Oppos S get started. End quote. North Carolina law gives a person full authority to change her will at any time, with or without notifying her beneficiaries. No warning required. No explanation owed. I signed the new documents in early February and drove home lighter than I and Oppos D felt in years. The second thing I did was start photographing. I went through the garage first, the empty space where Walter and Oppos S leaf blower used to live, the bare corner where the pressure washer had sat, the drill kit long gone. I photographed the gap in the fence where the extension cord had run, the dead patch of grass in the driveway where Derek and Oppos S truck idled overnight, week after week. Every photograph was time-stamped automatically. Everything went into a folder I labeled Home Inventory, 2018 to present. By the end of 3 Saturdays I had over 200 photographs. The third thing I did was harder than either of the others. I called Renata over for coffee, told her everything, the falling out, the will, the photographs, and asked her a question I already half knew the answer to. End quote. If something happens, if this ever comes to a head in a way that gets loud, will you be there? End quote. Renata didn't and Oppos T hesitate. End quote. I and Oppos V watched that man take from you people for 6 years. I and Oppos V been waiting for someone to finally say something out loud. Yes. I and Oppos L'll be there. End quote. I tried one more time with Renee before I let any of it go further, because I owed that much to the woman who had once promised me something in front of our whole family, or I owed it to the version of myself that hadn't and Oppos T yet fully let go. I went to her door on a Sunday afternoon in March. She answered in a sweatshirt, coffee in hand, looking at me the way you look at a delivery you wearin' and Oppos T expecting. End quote, Mom. Hey, what and Oppos S up? End quote. End quote. I and Oppos D like to talk, end quote, I said. End quote. Just the two of us about what and Oppos S been going on. End quote. Something moved across her face. Not quite guilt, not quite End quote. Mom, please Don and Oppos T make this into something bigger than it is. Derek and Oppos S really stressed at work right now. Can you just give it some time? End quote. End quote. Renee, your father has a bruise on his shoulder that took 3 weeks to fade. End quote. She looked down at her coffee cup. End quote. That was an accident. End quote. End quote. I know it was, end quote, I said. End quote. That and oppose. S not the point I and oppose am making. End quote. End quote. I really can and oppose T do this right now. End quote. She stepped back from the doorway. End quote. I and oppose I'll call you. Okay? End quote. She closed the door. I stood on her front step for a moment, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from loving someone who will not let you reach her. That night I sent her a long message. Every item on the list, every date, every incident laid out plainly and without accusation. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not her enemy. I told her I needed her to read it and respond so we could find a way forward. She read it at 11:47 that night. The little checkmark told me so. She never replied. The next morning at 8:15 Derek pounded on my front door. Not knocked, pounded. I opened it. He was in his work clothes, jaw set, eyes sharp with the kind of anger that had clearly been marinating overnight. End quote. You got a problem with my wife, Elle? Sending her guilt trips at midnight? What exactly are you trying to start? End quote. I looked at him standing on my porch in the March cold. This man who had taken my husband and Oppo's tools and our electricity and our parking spot and slowly our daughter and Oppo's loyalty, now standing at my door acting as though I were the one who had crossed a line. End quote. I texted my daughter, Derek. Not you. End quote. He stared at me, jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't and Oppo's swallow. Then he turned and walked back down the driveway. 3 days later, Renee called to tell me Thanksgiving was going to be at our house that year. Derek and Oppo's idea. 50 people. She said it the way you might mention a change in the weather. Before I tell you what happened next. 50 people, one backyard, and a man who had absolutely no idea what was already waiting for him. Derek did not ask. He announced. That was how it had always been with him. Not a question posed, but a declaration delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had never once been told no in a way that actually stuck. End quote. How many people? End quote. I asked Renee on the phone. A pause. End quote. Around 50. End quote. End quote. Renee, your father and I are not running a catering operation. End quote. End quote. It and Oppo's not like that. It and Oppo's just family and friends. It and Oppo's I'll be relaxed. End quote. End quote. Whose family? Whose friends? End quote. Another pause, slightly longer. End quote. It and Oppo's I'll be fine, Mom. I and Oppo's I'll help. End quote. She did not help. What she did, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, was appear at our back gate on a Saturday morning wearing gardening gloves, moving with the brisk, purposeful energy of a woman who had already decided something and did not want to discuss it. End quote. What are you doing? End quote. I asked, stepping out of the garage. End quote. Just clearing some space for the tables and the grill setup. End quote. She was already pulling at the edge of Walter and Oppo's herb border, yanking up the little wooden stakes that marked the rows. End quote. Derek wants room for cornhole too. End quote. Something dropped in my chest. End quote. Renee, that and Oppo's your father and Oppo's garden. End quote. End quote. Dad, it and Oppo's just some plants. End quote. She didn't and Oppo's look up. End quote. We need the space. End quote. End quote. Does your father know you and Oppo's redoing this? End quote. She straightened, pulled off one glove, looked at me with an expression working hard to be dismissive without quite getting there. End quote. I and Oppo's I'll talk to him. It and Oppo's fine. End quote. Walter found out that evening when he went out to check the herb border and found it half dismantled. The little labeled stakes pulled and stacked near the fence, the rosemary he and Oppo's grown for 6 years uprooted and lying on its side in the dirt. He came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway, his face very still, hands at his sides. End quote. Ellie, end quote, he said. His voice didn't in Oppo's break. It was something worse than breaking. The voice of a man who had run out of the energy required to fall apart. End quote. She took my rosemary. End quote. I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around him, and he pressed his forehead against my shoulder and took one long, slow breath. I know, I said. You had that plant for 6 years. I know, sweetheart. He stepped back, wiped his eyes quickly like he was annoyed at himself for them, and turned to the sink. Well, I suppose I and Oppos, I'll start over in the spring. That was Walter, 72 years old, already planning next season and Oppos' garden while the dirt from his uprooted rosemary was still on his daughter and Oppos' gloves. The second thing came on a Thursday when I went to open our home safe in the study to retrieve our homeowner and Oppos' insurance documents. I turned the dial to the sequence I and Oppos' used for a decade. It didn't and Oppos' open. I tried again. Same result. I sat back in my chair and looked at that safe for a long moment, something cold and deliberate moving through my chest. I called the manufacturer, verified ownership with the serial number and purchase receipt from my filing cabinet, and had the code reset that same evening. Later I asked Renee about it on the phone. A pause that ran a half-second too long. I might have mentioned the combination to Derek once. He needed the car insurance paperwork a few months back after that fender bender. It was an emergency, Mom. He changed my combination, Renee. He probably just, I and Oppos. I'm sure he didn't and Oppos mean, he changed the combination on my safe. In my house. She went quiet. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say. The quiet of someone choosing not to say what she was thinking. I and Oppos, I'll talk to him, she said finally. She never did, or if she did, I never heard about it. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat alone in the kitchen after Walter had gone to bed and pulled out the album one more time. Not to look at it, just to hold it. I thought about the photograph of Renee at 8 in the doorway of the room Walter built her. I thought about the combination on my safe. I thought about Walter saying he and Oppos plant again in the spring. I put the album down and looked out at the dark backyard, the space that would be full of Derek and Oppos' 50 guests in 12 hours. Tomorrow, I said quietly to the empty kitchen. Everything changes. Thanksgiving morning broke cold and clear over Asheville. By 8:30 the sky was that particular pale blue late autumn mountain mornings get, thin and bright and entirely without warmth. I and Oppos been up since 6. Walter was in the kitchen making his sweet potato casserole, the one his own grandmother had taught him, the one Micah always asked for by name and ate 3 helpings of. The smell of brown sugar and cinnamon moved through the house like something that belonged to a quieter, different version of this day. You Don and Oppos, have to do that, I told him, coming to stand beside him at the counter. I know I Don and Oppos have to. He smoothed the top of the casserole with the back of a spoon. I want to. It and Oppos' Thanksgiving, Ellie. Some things Don and Oppos change just because other things do. I looked at him for a moment, this man who had been through everything this year and was still standing at his own counter on a cold November morning, making his grandmother and Oppos' recipe for a party he hadn't and Oppos' been consulted about, and felt something move through me too large and too old to name properly. It and Oppos' going to be a good day, I said. He glanced at me sideways. Is it? Yes, I said. One way or another. By 9 Derek was already in our backyard. I heard his pickup pull in, and then the whine of the pressure washer I hadn't and Oppos' seen in over a year running full blast against the patio stones. I stepped onto the back porch. There he was, blasting the flagstones for the party setup, having rolled the machine out of his own garage, where it had apparently lived without ever once being returned. Derek. That and Oppos' Walter and Oppos' pressure washer. He didn't and Oppos' look up, didn't and Oppos' stop his stride. The first guest I was genuinely glad to see was Renata, who came through the side gate around 11:15 with a 6-pack of local IPA and the particular calm of a woman who and Oppos' Dee spent 31 years in law enforcement and knew exactly what kind of day this was shaping up to be. She found me on the porch and handed me a beer. End quote. How you holding up, Elle? End quote. End quote. Ask me again in a few hours, Renata. End quote. She looked out at the backyard, at Derek holding court near the smoker, at the 50 folding chairs arranged across the grass, at Walter moving quietly between kitchen and porch, carrying dishes he and Oppos. Dee cooked himself for guests he hadn't and Oppos. Tea invited. She opened her own beer and took a long drink. End quote. I and Oppos. We got my phone with me, end quote, she said simply. End quote. Good camera on it. End quote. I looked at her. She looked back with the flat, steady expression of a woman who had already made a decision and wasn't and Oppos. Tea looking for discussion. End quote. Okay, end quote, I said. Warren Achebe arrived shortly after noon. I recognized him from across the yard before Derek had a chance to make introductions, broad-shouldered in a quarter zip, the kind of handshake that meant something. Derek brought him over near the drink cooler. End quote. Warren, this is Ellie, Renee and Oppos. Mom. End quote. Warren shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye the way fewer and fewer people seem to these days. End quote. Eleanor. Good to finally see you again. Derek talks about you. End quote. End quote. Does he? End quote, I said. Warren held my gaze a beat longer than the moment strictly required, then looked away across the yard. End quote. He does, end quote. He said evenly and left it there. By noon 50 people filled my backyard. Derek moved among them like a man at the peak of his own story. And I stood at the edge of my own porch in front of my own house, beside the oak tree I and Oppos, planted with my own hands nearly 40 years ago, and waited. The party was loud in the way parties get loud when the joy is borrowed. People laughed at the right moments, filled their plates, moved between clusters of conversation with the easy looseness of a Saturday-shaped Thursday. Derek worked the crowd the way he always did. A hand on a shoulder here, the big lift of his voice when he wanted to be heard, which was most of the time. Renee moved quietly alongside him, refilling drinks, steering people toward the food, performing the role of gracious host in a home that belonged to her parents. Walter sat in the cushioned chair near the back door, the one I and Oppos, put there years ago so he could be outside without standing all afternoon, and Margaret Ito had arrived with a covered pan of her mother and Oppos' biscuits and hadn't and Oppos' left his side since. The two of them talked in the low, unhurried way of old friends who and Oppos been close long enough not to need volume. I watched from the porch and did what I and Oppos done since January. I waited. It was Margaret who started it, though she didn't and Oppos mean to start anything. She was the most naturally honest person I and Oppos ever known, not blunt, not unkind, just constitutionally incapable of pretending things were different from what they were. She leaned toward Walter and said, loud enough to carry to the three people nearest them, and quote, Walter, I have to say, last February when you were laid up with your knee, I thought for sure Renee would be over every day. I brought soup on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. I never saw her car in the driveway once. End quote. The three people nearest went quiet. The quiet spread outward the way quiet does when something true has been said in public. End quote. Margaret, end quote. Derek called out, close enough to have heard, his voice carrying with practiced ease, the tone of a man redirecting an inconvenient conversation, end quote. You want some of this brisket? Smoked it myself this morning. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos am fine, thank you, Derek. End quote. Margaret turned back to Walter as though he hadn't and Oppos spoken at all. Micah had been playing near the back fence with two of Derek and Oppos' younger cousins, chasing something in the grass with the focused intensity only a 5-year-old can bring to an undefined game. He broke away and ran across the yard, throwing himself against my legs with enough force to make me grab the porch railing. End quote. Gigi. End quote. He tilted his head back to look up at me, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. End quote. Can I have more of Grandpa and Oppos' sweet potato stuff? End quote. End quote. You and Oppos have to ask Grandpa. End quote. End quote. He said to ask you, end quote. End quote. Then yes. End quote. He beamed and ran back toward Walter and Oppos' chair. One of Derek and Oppos' friends, a younger man in a Panthers cap standing nearby, watched him go. And quote, that kid loves his grandpa, end quote. He said to no one in particular. His wife nodded. End quote, you can just tell. He went straight to him. End quote. Derek heard that too. I saw it in the set of his shoulders. A few minutes later the same man crouched down next to Micah. End quote, hey buddy. You know when your mom and Appo's birthday is? End quote. Micah scrunched up his face, thinking hard, then shook his head. End quote. What about your dad and Appo's? End quote. More scrunching, another head shake. End quote. What about Gigi and Appo's? End quote. Micah and Appo's face cleared completely. End quote. March 2nd, end quote. He said immediately, with the confidence of someone reciting something told and retold and celebrated. End quote. And Grandpa and Appo's is November 14th. Gigi makes a real cake every year from scratch with the little flowers on top because Grandpa likes flowers. End quote. The man in the cap laughed and looked up at me. I kept my expression even but felt something press against my sternum. Not quite pain, not quite pride. Exactly the combination of both that only a grandchild can produce. Derek did not laugh. Renata had positioned herself near the side fence with her beer and her phone, talking easily with a couple I recognized from down the block. She wasn't in Appo's. Obviously watching anything. But I had known Renata Cruz for 13 years, and I knew the difference between a woman who was relaxed and a woman who was ready. She caught my eye once across the yard, gave me the smallest possible nod. I nodded back. Margaret, still sitting with Walter, had moved on to a story about her sister and Appo's kitchen renovation when she paused mid-sentence and said, with the same mild, unhurried tone she used for everything, end quote, oh, and Walter, I meant to ask. How in Appo's your shoulder? I saw what happened through my kitchen window back in October. That looked like a bad fall. End quote. The yard didn't in Appo's go entirely quiet this time, but the cluster nearest the back door went very still. Walter and Appo's chin came up slightly. End quote. It healed fine, end quote, he said. End quote. Thank you for asking. End quote. Margaret nodded, satisfied, and returned to her sister and Appo's kitchen renovation as though she and Appo's simply been checking the weather. But the people who and Appo's gone still had heard every word. And Derek, standing 10 feet away with a pair of tongs in his hand and a smile beginning to stiffen at the edges, had heard it too. He did not like being paid attention to for the wrong reasons. And this afternoon, the wrong kind of attention was gathering around him the way clouds gather before a storm, quietly, from every direction, without a single dramatic announcement. It was Derek and Appo's cousin Bianca who said the thing nobody else had managed to say. She and Appo's driven up from Charlotte with her husband for the holiday, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, a middle school principal, the particular confidence of someone who spends her professional life saying difficult things to people who Dawn and Appo's want to hear them. She and Appo's wandered inside to use the bathroom and come back through the living room, and something on the wall had stopped her. I found her still standing in front of it when I came inside for napkins. End quote. Is this Renee? End quote. She asked, looking at the framed photograph, cap and gown, arms around my neck, both of us caught in the middle of something too large to contain. End quote. It is, end quote, I said. End quote. She looks so happy. End quote. Bianca tilted her head, studying it. End quote. There and Appo's something written underneath. Is that your handwriting? End quote. End quote. It is. End quote. She leaned closer and read it aloud quietly. End quote. Renee and Appo's promise, June 2015. End quote. She straightened up and looked at me with the eyes of a good principal, always reading more than the surface. End quote. What was the promise? End quote. I didn't in Appo's answer right away. Not because I didn't in Appo's no, but because I was deciding whether this was a door I wanted to open in my own living room on Thanksgiving afternoon. Renee had come inside behind me and stopped at the edge of the hallway. Bianca looked from the photograph to me, then, noticing Renee, to her. End quote. Renee, honey, what was the promise? Sounds like something meaningful. End quote. Renee and Appo's. Renee stood in the hallway looking at the photograph, her eyes bright and wet at the edges, pressing her lips together the way she had since she was a little girl trying not to cry. For one long moment she looked at that picture of herself at 22. Her whole face open with a kind of happiness that doesn't and oppose. Yet know what it will cost. I watched something move through her, she wooed and oppose. Let land. Then Derek and oppose. Voice came in from outside, loud and easy over the general noise. And quote, Renee, hey, can you grab the extra napkins? People are asking. And quote. She blinked, took one breath, went to the closet, got the napkins and walked back out without looking at me. I stood alone in my living room for a moment. Then I went outside. Derek had gathered a small crowd near the smoker. A couple of his friends, a few cousins, Warren standing slightly apart with his beer, careful expression on his face. I was crossing the yard to refill Walter and Appo's St when Derek glanced over, something shifting across his face, the particular calculation of a man reading an audience and deciding to perform. And quote, hey. And quote. His voice carried loud enough to draw attention. And quote, there she goes. Can you grab the extra propane from the garage while you and Appo's? At it, L? It and Appo's just sitting there. And quote. I stopped walking. Turned slowly. And quote, the propane and quote, I said and quote, is next to the workbench in my garage. And quote. And quote. Yeah, I know where it is. And quote, his smile didn't and Appo's quite reach his eyes. And quote, that and Appo's. Why I and Appo's am asking. You and Appo's. Heading that way anyway. You and Appo's. Not doing anything. And quote. The yard around us had gotten quieter, not silent, there were still conversations happening at the far tables, music from a speaker near the fence, but the cluster nearest us had tuned in the way people tune in when they sense a thing becoming a different kind of thing. And quote, Derek. And quote. My voice came out even and flat. And quote. I have been keeping this family running since before you had your first job out of college. Don and Appo's. Tell me what I and Appo's am not doing. And quote. His eyes sharpened. And quote. You know what your problem is? And quote. His voice had changed, the performance was gone, replaced with something that had been sitting underneath it for a long time, waiting for exactly this kind of audience. And quote. You act like you and Appo's owed something. Like because you served and because you raised a daughter, and because you write little captions under photographs that entitles you to respect you Haven and Appo's earned in years. End quote. The cluster near the smoker went completely still. Warren, standing slightly apart with his beer at his side, had stopped moving. End quote. I built this family and Appo's stability, end quote, I said. End quote. I served this country for 24 years. I raised your wife. You will not use that word in my direction, Derek. Not in my yard. Not in front of my family, end quote. Something ugly moved across his face. The kind of ugly that lives in a man accustomed to being the loudest voice in a room, discovering that loud ISN and Appo's the same is right. End quote, useless, end quote. He said again slowly like he was tasting it. End quote. Yeah, I said it. What are you gonna do about it, old woman? End quote. He took a step toward me. Just one, but a step with intent behind it, the step of a man who has decided that size is an argument. End quote. You think I Don and Appo's see what you are? End quote. His voice dropped to something meant to carry only to the people immediately around us, which was most of the yard by then. End quote. You and Appo's. A retired soldier living off a pension, sitting in that house watching the world go by, pretending you still matter. Renee feels sorry for you, Eleanor. We both do. End quote. Every muscle in my body had gone still. End quote. Derek, end quote. Renata and Appo's voice came from 6 feet to my left, calm, measured, the particular authority of a woman who and Appo's spent 31 years deciding when a situation required intervention. End quote. I and Appo's stop right there. End quote. Derek glanced at her. Something flickered behind his eyes, a half-second of recalculation. Then he looked back at me and made his decision. End quote. I and Appo's am not scared of either of you, end quote. He said it loud enough for the whole yard. End quote. You want to know what I think? I think you and Appo's a 71-year-old woman who, end quote. Micah came out of nowhere. He and Appo's been near the back fence, and he crossed the yard at a dead run the way children run when something has frightened them. and the only direction that makes sense is toward the person who has always been safe. He hit my legs and wrapped both arms around them, face pressed against my thigh, whole body shaking. End quote, Gigi, end quote. His voice was muffled, thick with the specific terror of a child who doesn't and oppose. Understand what and oppose. Happening but understands completely that it and oppose. Wrong. End quote. Gigi, stop. End quote. Derek looked at his son clinging to my legs. He did not stop. End quote. You need to handle your kid, end quote. Derek said, pointing a finger at Micah. End quote. Get him out of the way because you and me, we are not done. End quote. He took another step forward, hand coming up, jaw set, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once in his life encountered a consequence he couldn't and oppose. Talk his way out of. That was the last mistake Derek Holbrook ever made in my backyard. There are things a woman learns in 24 years of military service. Not the things people imagine when they hear those words. Not the dramatic things. The real things, the things that live in the body after years of training until they and oppose. No longer decisions but simply what happens when a situation requires it. Economy of movement. Reading distance and angle and weight distribution in the time it takes to exhale. Knowing without thinking exactly where your feet are, and where the other person in oppo's weight is committed. Derek had a good 60 pounds on me in 30 years. What he did not have was any understanding whatsoever of what he was walking into. I put my hand on Micah and Oppo's shoulder and looked at Bianca and Oppo's husband, one of Derek and Oppo's cousins, standing frozen nearby. End quote. Could you take him inside for me, please? End quote. He nodded immediately, put his hands on Micah and Oppo's shoulders and steered him gently toward the back door. Micah went, looking back at me over his shoulder, eyes wide and wet, until the door closed behind him. I turned back to Derek. Renata had moved to a position slightly to his left without appearing to do so. I registered it without looking directly at her. End quote, Eleanor. End quote, Renata and Oppo's voice was steady, final. End quote. You want me to handle this? End quote. End quote, no, end quote, I said. End quote, I don't and Oppo's tea. End quote. Derek watched this exchange with the contempt of a man who believed he was watching two old women decide which one of them was least afraid of him. He shook his head with a short, dismissive laugh. End quote. This is unbelievable. You and Oppo's both serious right now, end quote. He took the last step forward, his right hand coming up. Not a precise movement, not a trained one, just the swing of a large man who has decided the conversation is over and force is the period at the end of his sentence. He never landed it. I had spent 2 decades learning how to move inside a person in Oppo's reach before the reach could find me. My left foot stepped forward into the outside of his plant foot, the footwork so embedded in muscle memory it required no conscious instruction. My right hand closed around his wrist at the apex of the swing, not fighting the momentum but redirecting it, adding to it, using the weight he and Oppo's committed to that swing against the joints carrying it. My hip turned into him. His own forward momentum became the problem. Physics, not strength. He went down hard into the grass, face first, both knees, the air leaving him in one involuntary sound. I came down with him, one knee in the grass beside him, his right arm secured behind his back in a position that made further movement both painful and structurally inadvisable. He tried to get up. His body would not cooperate. End quote. Let me up, end quote. He said into the grass, voice strangled and furious. End quote. Let me up right now. End quote. End quote. I will, end quote, I said. End quote. When you and Oppo's redone. End quote. End quote. I am going to, end quote. End quote. You and Oppo's going to what, Derek? End quote. My voice had not risen by a single decibel. End quote. You already said what you were going to do. You said it in front of 50 people. That and Oppo's called a criminal threat under North Carolina law. You advanced toward me after making that threat. That and Oppo's called assault. I am a 71-year-old woman who asked you to stop. You did not stop. Everything that happened after that is self-defense, end quote. He thrashed once more. His shoulder protested with a sound that made several nearby guests wince. For one suspended, aching, irretrievable moment, her eyes found mine. and I saw in them the little girl from the photograph on the living room wall, horrified, undone. Then she looked away. Warren had not moved from his position near the smoker. He was watching Derek on the ground with the expression of a man updating information he and Oppos suspected for some time. He looked at me once, briefly, and gave a small nod that contained more communication than most sentences. Derek stopped struggling. The speaker near the fence played on. And quote, "Are you done?" And quote, I asked. A pause long enough to cost him something. And quote, "Yeah," and quote, he said into the grass, low and worn out. And quote, "Yeah, I and Oppos am done." And quote. I released his arm and stood up. Derek pushed himself to his knees in the grass, face flushed deep red, jaw working. He looked up at me from the ground in front of 50 people, and I watched his arrogance try to reassemble itself and fail to find all the pieces. Derek and Oppos' shirt was untucked on one side, his collar twisted, a faint smear of dirt along one cheekbone he hadn't and Oppos' yet noticed, one shoulder sitting slightly lower than the other in the unconscious way of a body quietly cataloging what had just been done to it. He looked around the yard. 50 people looked back, not the way they and Oppos' been looking at him 3 hours earlier, with the easy social attention of guests enjoying a party, but with the particular stillness of people who and Oppos' watch something they cannot unwatch, still deciding what it means and what, if anything, it requires of them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialed with the focused urgency of a man who had just located the one weapon he believed he still had, turned slightly away from me as the line connected, dropped his voice into the register of practiced, controlled distress. And quote, "Yes, I need police at. My mother-in-law just attacked me without any provocation. She assaulted me in front of my family and my guests. She needs to be removed from the property immediately." End quote. A pause, his free hand coming up to press against his chest in a gesture of distress I did not believe for 1 second. End quote. She and Oppos' dangerous. Please hurry." End quote. He ended the call and straightened up, some of the old confidence seeping back into his posture. Squared shoulders, lifted chin, the particular set of a man who has pressed a button and is now waiting for the machine to do what machines are supposed to do. End quote. "We and Oppos' I'll see how this goes for you." End quote, he said, looking at me. I did not respond. I had nothing to say to Derek Holbrook that had not already been said, or demonstrated, or documented in 211 time-stamped photographs. What Derek did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never once in 6 years paid enough attention to the people around him to understand what they were actually capable of, was that Renata Cruz had made her own phone call 4 minutes earlier. Not to 911. She and Oppos' stepped quietly to the side fence during the confrontation, phone already out, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who has spent 31 years arriving at situations ahead of the people who thought they were controlling them. She and Oppos' placed a quiet call to a number she hadn't and Oppos' dialed in over a year, a number that apparently still picked up on the second ring. She was sliding her phone back into her jacket pocket when Derek finished his call. I looked at her across the yard. She picked up her drink from the fence post where she and Oppos' set it down, took a long unhurried sip, and looked back at me with the expression of a woman who has already done what needed doing and is content to wait. Renee had moved to stand beside Derek. She had her hand on his arm, not holding it, not gripping it with the urgency of a woman frightened for her husband, just resting there, the gesture of a woman who and Oppos' chosen her position and was standing in it because she and Oppos' run out of other positions to take. Her face was composed in a way that cost her something visible. I could see the cost of it in the muscles along her jaw, in the deliberate steadiness of her breathing, in the way her eyes moved to me once and then away and did not come back. I thought about the graduation photograph. Renee and Oppos' promise, June 2015. I thought about a lot of things in the 11 minutes that followed. Walter had not moved from his chair near the back door. Margaret sat beside him with one hand resting over his on the armrest, not speaking, not filling the space with reassurance neither of them needed, just present, the way Margaret had always been present that entire year, solidly, without fanfare, exactly where she was needed, without being asked. The police arrived 11 minutes after Derek and Oppos' call. 2 cruisers pulled up along the street. I heard the engines first, then saw the light bar reflection sweep across the garage door. Two officers came through the side gate with the careful scanning attention of people walking into a situation they and oppose, have been given incomplete information about and are rapidly trying to complete. The taller of the two, Officer Marcus Doyle according to the nameplate, took in the yard in one long practice sweep, 50 people in loose clusters, a man with dirt on his cheek and a twisted collar standing beside a woman with her hand on his arm, an older man seated near the back door with a woman and Oppo's hand over his, and Renata Cruz standing at the side fence with a drink and the expression of someone waiting for a bus she already knew the schedule of. Doyle stopped walking. End quote, Renata. End quote. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but the particular recalibration that happens when a familiar variable enters an equation that had seemed straightforward a moment before. End quote, didn't and Oppos. Expect to see you here, Marcus. End quote. Renata set her drink down on the fence post with the unhurried ease of a woman at a Sunday cookout. End quote, good timing. End quote. Derek stepped forward before Doyle could process the Renata variable any further. End quote, officer. End quote. His voice had the shape of an authority he no longer had access to. End quote, that woman right there. End quote. He pointed at me, his finger not entirely steady. End quote. Assaulted me without any warning or provocation in front of 50 witnesses. I want her arrested. I want her removed from this property immediately. This is my family and Oppo's home and she attacked me in front of my son. End quote. Doyle looked at Derek with the neutral, patient attention of a man who has heard a great many versions of a great many stories, and has learned through long experience to wait before deciding which parts of any version are actually load-bearing. End quote, sir. I and Oppo's am going to need you to slow down. Can you tell me what happened step by step starting from the beginning? End quote. End quote, she attacked me. That and Oppo's what happened? End quote. End quote, from the beginning. End quote. The repetition was gentle. The weight behind it was not. Derek started again. His version was organized and indignant, delivered with the fluency of a man who and Oppo's been composing it in his head since he hit the grass. It was also missing, among other things, the word useless spoken loudly in a yard full of guests, the step forward with the hand coming up, the 7 minutes of escalating verbal threat that had preceded any physical contact of any kind, and the moment Micah had wrapped his arms around my legs and Derek had told me to get the boy out of the way because we were not done. When he finished, Doyle looked at Renata. End quote. You have something on this? End quote. Renata reached into her jacket pocket with the unhurried motion of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this question. She held out her phone. 4 minutes and 38 seconds of footage, shot from her position near the side fence, capturing the full width of the yard and the confrontation in its unedited entirety, with the steady, practiced hand of a woman who and Oppos spent 3 decades documenting things that mattered in situations where documentation was the difference between the truth being known and the truth being buried. Doyle watched all 4 minutes and 38 seconds without interruption, without comment, without looking up. Somewhere in the first 45 seconds his weight shifted subtly forward, the narrowing of focus that happens when a person watching a video realizes what they and Oppos re-seeing is going to determine what happens next in a way that can and Oppos walk back. He handed the phone back to Renata, turned to his partner, exchanged something brief and wordless, and looked at Derek. End quote, sir. End quote, he said. End quote, I and Oppos am going to need you to step over here with me. End quote. Derek and Oppos' confidence, which had been rebuilding itself steadily since the moment he dialed 911, made one visible, effortful attempt to hold its shape. Then it didn't and Oppos end quote, wait, end quote, he said, his voice cracking on the first word, not fully recovering. End quote, wait, you watched that video but you have to understand the context. She and I have history. This has been building for years. She and Oppos' been hostile toward me, toward my family. You can and Oppos just look at a 4-minute clip and end quote, step over here please, end quote. Doyle and Oppos' voice was not unkind. It was something more final than unkind, the voice of a decision already made, simply being communicated. The yard was absolutely quiet. Even the wind, I thought, had the decency to hold still. I have watched a person and Oppos' confidence leave their body before. In the army we had a name for it, the moment someone finally understands at a cellular level that the situation they believe they controlled has been controlling them all along. It is not a loud moment. It does not announce itself. It is simply the instant when a certain kind of light goes out behind the eyes and does not come back. I watched it happen to Derek Holbrook on the grass of my backyard, and I felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What I felt was older and quieter, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years hoping not to arrive at the place she always knew she was heading. Doyle stepped Derek to the far edge of the yard near the side fence and spoke to him in the measured, methodical way of a man reading items off a list. I was close enough to hear most of it. End quote. The video clearly shows you advancing toward the other party after making a verbal threat. Under North Carolina General Statute 1433, a verbal threat combined with apparent ability and intent to carry it out constitutes simple assault, regardless of whether physical contact occurred first. The subsequent physical contact you initiated, your arm coming up toward the other party, is documented on video and corroborated by multiple witness statements. End quote. Derek and Appo's instincts, such as they were, kicked in. End quote. She grabbed me. She put her hands on me. That and Appo's battery. End quote. End quote. The other party has a credible claim of self-defense under North Carolina General Statute 1451.1. End quote. Doyle said, without changing his tone. End quote. She was responding to an imminent physical threat you had both verbally announced and physically initiated. That and Appo's a straightforward application of the state and Appo's self-defense statute. End quote. Derek stared at him. The words were landing, but the implications were arriving on a slight delay, the way sound arrives after lightning. End quote. This you and Appo's not being fair. I have a right to defend myself. She and Appo's been hostile toward me for years. Ask my wife. Ask Renee. End quote. Doyle glanced toward Renee, who was standing 8 feet away. End quote. Ma and Appo's, did you witness the altercation? End quote. Renee and Appo's jaw was tight. Her eyes moved to Derek, then to me, then to the ground in front of her feet. End quote. Yes, end quote, she said quietly. End quote. Did your husband make verbal threats toward your mother prior to any physical contact? End quote. A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. End quote. He was upset. End quote, Renee said. End quote. Things escalated. End quote. Doyle wrote something in his notepad. He did not ask a follow-up question. He did not need to. Warren had been standing near the smoker through all of this, beer untouched at his side, watching with the focused, assessing attention of a man who makes consequential decisions for a living. When Doyle finished writing, Warren set his beer down on the table beside him, buttoned the top button of his quarter zip with the deliberate composure of a person preparing to leave, and walked across the yard toward me. He stopped in front of me and put out his hand. I shook it. End quote. I and Appo's. I'm sorry this happened in your home, Eleanor. End quote. He said, his voice low and direct and entirely without performance. End quote. I want you to know what I saw today is documented in my head the same way it and Appo's documented on that phone. End quote. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he turned, walked to where Derek stood with Officer Doyle and said 4 words. End quote. We and Appo's LL talk on Monday. End quote. Not a question. Not a threat. Just a statement of inevitable fact delivered in the voice of a man who had already made the relevant decision and was simply informing the affected party. Derek watched Warren walk out through the side gate. The color in his face had moved through red and arrived somewhere past it, a gray stunned pallor that made him look suddenly much younger than 41. Doyle read Derek the charges. Simple assault, disorderly conduct. He explained each one in plain language, and with each explanation Derek seemed to compress slightly, like a structure losing load-bearing capacity from the inside. Renee stood beside her husband through all of it, her hand at her side now, no longer touching him, her face a controlled, careful blank, the one she and Appo's been practicing for years, the one she put on when she and Appo's decided not to feel whatever she was feeling until later in private, where no one could see it cost her anything. Part 16. What people do with their hands. When Doyle finished, the yard was very quiet. And then something happened I had not anticipated, and that undid me more completely than anything else that afternoon. People started cleaning up. Not all at once. It started with Margaret, who stood up from her chair beside Walter, went to the nearest folding table, and began stacking paper plates. Then the couple from down the block joined her. Then Renata picked up a trash bag from the stack near the gate, and began moving through the yard collecting cups. Then 3 of Derek and Appo's own cousins, not his close friends, not the ones who and Appo's D laughed at his stories but the quieter ones who and Appo's D watched the afternoon unfold with the discomfort of people realizing they and Appo's D being guests at the wrong kind of party, began folding chairs. Within 15 minutes, my backyard was being restored by the people who had watched it be used. Walter sat in his chair and watched it happen, both hands wrapped around his glass, eyes bright and wet but not spilling over, chin lifted in the particular way it lifted when he was holding something large inside his chest and refusing to let it break his posture. Margaret came and sat beside him again when the cleanup was mostly done. She put her hand over his. End quote. You doing okay, Walter? End quote. He looked at the backyard, clean now, orderly, the folding chairs stacked in even rows against the fence, the tables cleared. His garden was still gone. His rosemary was still in a pile near the back fence. But the yard looked, for the first time all day, like it belonged to someone who was cared for. End quote. I think so, end quote, he said, his voice soft and steadier than I expected. End quote. I think I might be. End quote. Renee walked out through the side gate behind Derek without looking back. The backyard was cleaned by Ado and Appo's clock that evening, cleaner than it had ever been after any party Derek organized in our home. The folding chairs were stacked against the fence in even rows. The tables were wiped down, collapsed, and leaned against the garage wall. 3 full trash bags sat neatly by the side gate. Renata had swept the patio with my broom without being asked, and Margaret had washed every serving dish Walter owned and left them drying in the rack before she went home. Walter and I sat at the kitchen table after everyone had gone. He had a cup of chamomile tea. I had coffee black even though it was past 8 and I knew it would keep me up. I did not particularly want to sleep. We did not talk about what had happened. We did not need to. 38 years of marriage means you can sit with a thing together without picking it apart, can let it settle in the room between you without demanding it be named and categorized and resolved before you and Appo's allowed to breathe. Walter wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the steam rising from it. End quote. She didn't and Appo's tea look back, end quote, he said finally. End quote. No, end quote, I said. End quote. She didn't and Appo's tea. End quote. He nodded once slowly, the way he nodded when he was confirming something he and Appo's already known for a long time and was only now giving himself permission to acknowledge. End quote. Okay, end quote, he said. Just that one word, carrying everything. 2 days after Thanksgiving, Renee knocked on our front door. I heard it from the kitchen, set down my coffee cup, walked to the door and opened it. She stood on the porch in a gray coat, hair pulled back, eyes red at the edges in the way that meant she and Appo's been crying on the drive over and had tried to compose herself before getting out of the car. She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I thought about the little girl who had thrown her arms around my neck in the lavender bedroom Walter built her. I thought about the woman in the cap and gown who had made a promise in front of our whole family. I thought about Walter and Appo's rosemary lying in the dirt. I thought about Micah and Appo's arms shaking against my leg. I stepped back and closed the door gently without a word. I heard her stand on the porch a long time before her footsteps crossed the boards and went back down the steps. That evening she sent a message, long and careful, full of the kind of language people use when they and Appo's trying to apologize without fully examining what they and Appo's apologizing for. Walter read it on my phone, set it down on the counter, and looked out the kitchen window at the empty space where the herb garden used to be. End quote, she said. She and Appo's sorry, end quote, he said. End quote, I know, end quote, I told him. He looked at the window a moment longer. End quote, sorry doesn't end Appo's put my rosemary back. End quote. He picked up his dish towel and went back to what he and Appo's been doing. The following week Derek sent a message of his own. A threat of legal action. A civil suit for battery and emotional distress. Written in the inflated language of a man who had Googled just enough legal terms to feel dangerous. I forwarded it to Renata without responding, and she forwarded it to Officer Doyle, who noted it for the record. I also sent a copy to Priya Deshmukh, my attorney, who replied within the hour. Given the documented video evidence and the charges currently pending against Mr. Holbrook, I would not be concerned. I was not concerned. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Derek received a formal letter from his firm informing him that, following an internal review prompted by conduct documented in footage circulated within the professional community, his position was being terminated, effective immediately. Warren had not called it a threat when he said "we and Oppos LL talk on Monday." He had called it what it was, a statement of fact. A man with Derek and Oppos' credentials, Derek and Oppos' bravado, Derek and Oppos' absolute certainty that his charm insulated him from consequence, had built the entire architecture of who he believed himself to be on that job title, on being the man in the room with the loudest voice. Without it, I suspected the walls would take some time to find new shapes. I did not feel triumphant about that either. On a Saturday morning in early December, I went through the house methodically. I called a locksmith and had every exterior lock rekeyed: front door, back door, garage side entrance. I called the bank and formally removed Renee as an authorized user on the household account she and Oppos held access to for 4 years. I called the safe manufacturer and changed the combination for the second time, to a sequence I did not write down anywhere and did not intend to share with anyone except Walter. I did these things in order, calmly, the way I had done difficult things my entire life, one item at a time, without rushing, without drama. When I was done, I sat at the kitchen table and drank a glass of water. Then I went to the living room and took down the framed photograph of Renee and Derek and Oppos' wedding, the one that had hung beside the graduation picture for 5 years, and placed it face down in a cardboard box in the hall closet. I did not throw it away. I was not ready to decide what it meant yet, but I was not able to look at it either. The graduation picture stayed on the wall. Renee and Oppos' promise, June 2015. I was not ready to take that one down. January came the way New Year and Oppos' always do, quietly, no fanfare, just one morning waking up and the calendar having changed. Walter planted seeds in small plastic trays on the kitchen windowsill, getting a head start on the spring garden. He and Oppos' already ordered new rosemary from a nursery catalog, the page folded down at the corner. One morning in late January, I went out to the front porch for the newspaper and found something wedged under the edge of my ceramic flower pot by the step, a small folded square of paper, torn from a spiral notebook. I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was large and uneven, unmistakably a child and Oppos' letters formed with the careful effort of someone still learning that each one has a specific shape that has to be honored. There was a drawing at the bottom, 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing beside something that might have been a tree or might have been a garden bed. Underneath it, in the particular earnest spelling of a 5-year-old who has something important to say and is determined to say it correctly: "I miss you, Gigi. I am sorry for what Dad did. Love, Micah." I stood on the front porch in the January cold for a long time. Then I folded that piece of paper in half and placed it in the breast pocket of my coat, directly over my heart, and went inside. That evening Walter and I had dinner at the kitchen table, just the two of us. I and Oppos' made pot roast, the kind that takes all day, the kind that fills the whole house with the smell of it by 2 in the afternoon. I and Oppos' set the table with the good placemats, the ones we usually saved for company, and put a small candle in the middle. We sat down across from each other. I reached across the table and poured his tea. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. And quote, "This is nice, Ellie," end quote, he said softly. I looked at him, at the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the man who had stood in cold weather scraping frost off his own windshield without complaint, who had planned his spring garden from a catalog while his rosemary lay in the dirt, who had said sorry dozen and Oppos' put my rosemary back and gone right back to doing the dishes. End quote. "Yeah," end quote, I said. End quote, "It is." End quote. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. End quote, "It really is." End quote. I have told you everything now. Every borrowed tool that was never returned. Every electric bill that doubled without apology. Every evening I watched Micah fall asleep in Walter and Oppos' arms because his parents had somewhere better to be. Every moment Renee chose silence when I needed her voice. I do not tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because I spent 6 years confusing tolerance with love, and they are not the same thing. Tolerance without boundaries is not kindness. It is an open door that the wrong people will walk through every single time, and they will keep walking through it until you close it yourself. I believe every person is given a moment of clarity somewhere in her life, if she and Oppos is paying attention when it arrives. Mine came on a kitchen floor, holding my husband after he fell, watching my daughter walk out the door instead of kneeling beside us. That moment did not break me. It built me back into something I had almost forgotten, the woman I was before I started making myself smaller to keep the peace. My own hard-earned opinion is this. A woman who lets her family be mistreated in the name of keeping the peace will eventually lose both her family and her peace. Do not wait as long as I waited. The people who truly love you will never ask you to shrink yourself to make room for someone else in Oppos' arrogance. Micah is 6 now. He still leaves notes under the flower pot from time to time, when something is on his mind. Renee and I speak on the phone most weeks carefully, the way you speak to someone you are still deciding how much room to make for again. She has not brought Derek and Oppos' name into a single one of those calls, and I have not asked her to. Some doors you leave closed until the person on the other side has done the work of proving they and Oppos' changed, not just the work of saying so. Walter and Oppos' Rosemary came back in April, small and green and stubborn, exactly the way I expected it to. Some things, once you plant them right, find a way to grow back no matter what was done to them. I like to think people can be like that too if you give them enough time, and if you are honest enough with yourself about what deserves a second season and what does not. I am still deciding some days which one this is. But I know now, in a way I didn't end Oppos' for far too long, that deciding is mine to do. Nobody else in Oppos'. And that, more than anything else this whole ordeal taught me, is the part one hopes stays with you.